How's this for a Radio Friends with Christmas special? Episode 306.
Deicide.
A band which to this day is one of the most controversial death metal bands, at least in terms of the death metal scene's overall reception to them. There's a lot of people in the death metal scene nowadays that don't got a lot good to say about Deicide. Principally, I see anti-Deicide sentiment emanating from three different camps of people. The first one, I will say, were the tech death people in the early 2000s, or perhaps the deathcore people of today, that mistake the trappings of extremity, like gravity blasts, sweep picking, and all that, with actual intensity. To these people, somehow, and somehow more brutal and worthy of admiration than which obviously is false. Those other bands might be flashier. In terms of death metal as being an instrument of evil, they don't even come close. Another group of people I see hating on Deicide, we'll just call them post-Trump right-wing types that got into more extreme metal stuff because they heard a lot of the black metal guys were Nazis, and that bands like Argoslint were all about saying the
N-word, 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 N-word.
And now they're trying to get Satan out of death metal. Yeah, you're just interlopers, hipsters, and posers by any other name. Both of these groups of people can be safely ignored. However, the third camp of people are often older heads that apparently were around back when I guess Deicide wasn't so good live. Like, they got a lot of issues with Glenn Benton as a frontman, which maybe he was bad back in like the late 90s or like early 2000s or something, but I've seen Deicide a whole bunch of times since around like 2010 and they always seem to put on a good show, at least to my eyes and ears. I mean, that was one of their most technically complex songs, filmed on my terrible cell phone camera, and yet I could still hear every detail of the music, so I don't know. Personally, I think Deicide good live band. Deicide good band in general, and that's what this episode is going to be all about. Because if you claim to like death metal, and you don't like Deicide, you probably don't actually like death metal. And that's fine, that's okay. It takes all kinds. Super Weenie Hut Juniors.
Down the hall and to the left.
Alright, so that's probably the most controversial I'm ever going to get on this show. But for real, what makes Deicide special out of this slew of late 80s, early 90s satanic death metal band? Because there's plenty of stuff out there that's brutal, heavy, and satanic. Well, for one, I would say it's their talent for weaving their lyrics and overall vocal cadences into the percussive rhythm of the riffs. Something which they directly inherited from Slayer on songs like The Antichrist. Like, that stuff's almost kind of poetic, and if you considerably up the ante in terms of rhythmic intensity and complexity, but keep that same sense of epic evil poetry to it, you get parts in Deicide that go like, that's something you're not going to hear done as well by, honestly, any other band. The other thing Deicide has going for it is, I would say, their sense of pageantry and showmanship. Ideologically, they're probably not far removed from where a band like Immolation's coming from. But the way they communicate the same ideas is so exaggerated and out there and wacky. Glenn Benton, he's famous because he burned an inverted cross into his forehead. He made overtures to killing himself when he turned 33 in order to become the Antichrist. Way back when they were still called Carnage, they took a mannequin, filled it with raw meat, threw it into the mosh pit, and then the guys from Morbid Angel sicked a bunch of dogs on it. So you got people moshing, and there's like dogs tearing up this mound of flesh.
I'm so fucking crazy. Won't you?
That's pageantry. And Slayer had quite a bit of that too in their early days. But there's another band, another unsung influence on Deicide that Glenn Benton has actually mentioned in a couple different interviews that had even more of that, and that would be the band Exorcist, who I would say were a massive foundational influence on the more showy aspects of Deicide. Now, I covered Exorcist more than 3 years ago, way back on episode 140, but nobody watched that one. That's fine. Here's a brief summary of what that band's all about. They only did one album back in 1986, and it's secretly everybody from the old school power metal band Version Steel working under pseudonyms and playing stuff that, depending on how you look at it, is either the most evil speed metal of all time or perhaps even some of the earliest death metal ever. They got all kinds of weird interludes and ambient bits. It's probably the first time anybody in the metal scene heard the words Tiamat or Absu. And overall, it has this really dark atmosphere. as well as a very expressive vocal performance that doesn't sound too far off from what Glenn Benton would do. In addition to that, the quick rapid-fire soloing is also very Deicide-esque in tone and timbre. There's been a lot of effort and thought put into figuring out where each vocal stanza goes, and each different vocal line is almost like it's being sung by a different character. Proto Glenn Benton. And despite it being very heavy music, they managed to work in very catchy choruses as you're hearing right now. And the atmosphere is very dark and depraved. The whole first half of the album is a concept album about a satanic black mass, which was definitely influential in the sort of theatricality Deicide would be working with. And like Deicide after them, this music is highly rhythmic and there's a major emphasis on change-ups, revealing new layers of evil and depravity to the music. If you're into old school Deicide or Slayer's circa Show No Mercy, you really owe it to yourself to check out the Soul Exorcist album. And I'm sure Glenn Benton himself would agree with that. But getting back to Deicide, you take that pageantry of a band like Exorcist, that emphasis on rhythmic complexity and continuity, intertwining of guitar and vocals you get from Slayer, add all of the other extreme thrash metal stuff that was happening towards the end of the 80s, and then beef it up to become early death metal, you end up with some of the best death metal ever made. Early Deicide. When it comes to stacking up hyper catchy, yet also hyper brutal rhythm guitar riffs in order to generate compositional tension, you really can't get better than early Deicide. And here's that intertwining of rhythm guitar and vocals that I've been putting so much emphasis on. Incredibly brutal vocal performance, yet also very catchy and understandable. Deicide is one of the few death metal bands out there that I think is capable of writing an intentionally catchy chorus to a song without it sounding corny or forced. They also got those great rhythmic change-ups. And this part right here, so fast it almost blurs into chaos, but it's actually all very precisely done. Here we go again, more really catchy stuff that's also really brutal. Deicide appeals to those into musicianship looking for very complex and brutal type stuff. At the same time, it appeals to people that want to hear some catchy, evil metal that balances those two aspects of their sound perfectly, particularly on the first album, which is probably their catchiest. Also, the Hoffman brothers' guitar playing and Steve's drumming are like Slayer taken to a whole new level and possessed by the devil. Still striking nowadays in terms of how brutal yet catchy it all is. And much like Slayer, particularly on Rain and Blood, Glenn Benton has a real talent for crafting a story in the way that he unfolds all of these lyrical abominations. We're coming up to another important feature of Deicide's compositional process, the full stop, where everything shuts off and immediately comes back with something even more brutal sounding. In this case, a real catchy part. I mean, come on, you gotta love a song about Evil Dead.
Work shed.
Especially one that manages to capture the warped atmosphere of that movie by starting out from the viewpoint of Ash, the main character of the movie, and then switching over after the full stop to be from the perspective of the titular Evil Dead. You know, all those evil ghosts and spirits that you're hearing in these weird moaning noises. Deicide's 1990 self-titled album, absolute classic. But on their 1992 follow-up, Legion, they really pushed their sound about as far as it could go. It's by far their most extreme album, even to this day, and one of the most extreme death metal albums of all time, even compared to a lot of modern stuff. And in a lot of ways, it feels like a reaction to detractors of the first album. Specifically in the liner notes, Glenn Benton says no harmonizers or pitch shifters were utilized in the creation of this album. What he's talking about there is there was all kinds of weird post-recording manipulation of Glenn Benton's vocals on the first Deicide album, particularly when it got to the real Evil Dead sounding parts. Which personally I thought sounded cool as shit, but yeah, obviously you're not going to be able to pull that off live. The only vocal effects on Legion are just kind of standard stuff you would do on any album. He'll overdub himself, so like he'll do one line growling and one line screaming and playing both at the same time, and then there's some reverb on it, but that's about it. The music itself almost feels like live in studio, which is very impressive given how brutal and fast it is, both for the time and even compared to albums coming out today. There's the overdubs I'm talking about. Growling and screaming at the same time. Sounds evil as fuck. Great fucking vocals. Full stop. And the production and mixing on this is very far removed from what they were doing on the first album. In this case, the emphasis is on instrumental separation. So you can hear all the different guitar layers, and even the bass is very audible. Some people might not be fond of how chaotic the guitar solos are, but if you ask me, They're doing exactly what they need to for the music. It's atmospheric, evil, unholy. There's almost no fat to this music. Incredibly concise, and apparently they actually had to re-record the album because the first time they played it, it came out under half an hour. They were going so fast. Here's one of the most complex and strange parts of this music. Like, how do you even remember that part to pull it off live? But they do. A lot of this is like a rhythmically coiled spring just breaking. Also, this part rules.
TWU.
This song, Revocate the Agitator, probably my favorite song on the album. Definitely one of my favorite Deicide songs. And this whole album is full of weird technical bangers like that, to the point where it even alienated a lot of audiences at the time that got into them for how catchy they were on their first album. It's kind of funny how a lot of tech death people nowadays hate on Deicide, because Legion basically fuck-started that genre. I mean, let's say, you know, whatever your first death metal album ever is, Seven Churches, that's like the Wright brothers playing. By the time we get to like 1992, we're somewhere in between biplanes and like Stukas and Zeros, and then Deicide comes out of nowhere and just drops an F-14 on everything. Straight up, it's like,
You're not supposed to be here.
death metal in 1992 was not supposed to sound like this. By far one of the most punishing albums of its day. Like, this is a pretty standard groove right here, but look what they do with it moving forward. As the vocals come in, it kind of coils in on itself before then being abruptly straightened out again as we get into the verse. Then into this more pre-chorus section, it coils up again, right about here. They're constantly alternating between playing completely on the beat and inserting musical phrases between each beat, which is made even more impressive given how fast they're playing and how many abrupt tempo changes there are to keep track of. That said, they also managed to preserve that sense of pageantry that was present on their first album.
In the name of Satan, I condemn this image of God.
Like that wacky little spoken word bit right there. They've still got enough of that weird sort of Carnival Barker-esque atmosphere to their occultism on this album to hopefully still appeal to fans of the first Deicide album. And while maybe at the time a lot of people weren't that into Legion, a whole lot of people thought it was great as fuck. And nowadays it's kind of seen as being the essential Deicide classic. And now we get to some more controversial opinions I have on Deicide. Their third album, Once Upon the Cross, actually the first Deicide album I ever heard. If you look at the internet's appraisal of it, you'd think this album was a massive disappointment. Kind of the same thing that's going on with the second and third Unleashed albums, where I always thought they were fucking great. If you ask people on the street that are into death metal if these are good albums, they'll be like, hell yeah, brother. And yet the internet consensus appears to be that Once Upon the Cross is bad. I'm like, huh? Because for as long as I've been listening to it, I was always under the impression that, hey, this album sounds pretty good to me. And put it to the context of their overall discography, I think not only is it a great album, but it's a very interesting follow-up to an album like Legion. Because it preserves a lot of that weird coiled bent spring groove and technicality of the Legion album, while also incorporating a lot of the catchier grooviness that was part of their first album. I also really like the production on this album. Legion's a very clinical sounding album. This one sounds a lot more humid, dark, and atmospheric. And the vocals are still dope as fuck. Essentially, it's like they took the best aspects of their debut and Legion, and despite them being very different albums, managed to make them work together in concert. So if someone tells you this is a bad Deicide album, don't fucking listen to it.
Idiote, analfabete, mongoloide.
In addition to really distilling the essence of what made those first Deicide albums so good, in terms of groove mixed with technicality, they also incorporate a newfound focus on melody that I find to be very interesting. Like this tremolo pick consonant melody that opens up my favorite song on the album, When Satan Rules His World. That's pretty new for Deicide, but it fits right in. And it also provides a very interesting contrast to this album's heavy grooves, moving between those tremolo picked melodies and those incredibly chunky grooves like the one you're hearing right here gives this album a real sense of dynamism, particularly when put up against the tenser, more Legion-style grooves like this, before jumping back into that amazing melody from earlier. But wouldn't you believe, this melody right here, that ain't even the catchiest one in the song. No, that'd be this part. On Once Upon the Cross, not only are they paying attention to how the vocal cadence interacts with the rhythm guitar riff, now they're matching a sort of death metal vocal melody to a more consonant guitar part, which I find to be very interesting, and something I haven't really heard being utilized by bands that aren't Deicide. Once Upon the Cross might just be my favorite Deicide album currently. Honestly, that could change by the week though. A lot of times it's Legion, a lot of times it's the debut, and sometimes it's even the follow-up to Once Upon the Cross, that being Serpents of the Light, which unlike Once Upon the Cross, at least appears to have been reevaluated by the scene to the point where most people consider this to be a classic album. And I gotta say, I agree with them, because it's fucking good. And it keeps up with the Deicide trend of having each of their classic albums sound a little bit different from each other. On this album, they really focus on utilizing more of those consonant melodies, whilst bringing the intensity level back to something more approaching where they were going on Legion. This has helped quite a bit, not only by their incorporation of more of that vocal weirdness that was on the first album, but also their utilization of perhaps their nastiest guitar sound they ever had.
It sounds so wretched and foul.
It somehow managed to sound simultaneously incredibly bright and also really desiccated and brittle, and yet also very thick and heavy. This fucking melody right here is so good. Speaking of melody, the guitar solos this time around take on a more consonant melodic cast to them, almost sounding something like a prototype of what Nile would end up doing later on. Definitely my favorite lead guitar performance from the Hoffman brothers in the course of their tenure with Deicide. Where this album really stands out is in its penchant for compositional dynamism, perhaps even more so than their prior albums. Like this song right here, another one of my favorites, Blame It on God, starts out very short-clipped and percussive, before taking that same basic tonal skeleton and playing it in a more flowing and tremolo pick sort of manner. It really does feel like they're building up to something incredibly tense, particularly when you get to this sort of melodic staircase kind of riff, where they keep taking that same phrase and moving it farther and farther down the neck of the guitar, hitting more and more dissonant intervals between each set of notes, before then exploding into the song's main powerful groove. Right here. That whole build-up almost seemed kind of sexual in nature, man. Very primal. This might be the most savage and angry sounding of all Deicide albums, at least tied with Legion in that regard. And from there, you kind of hit more of a Deicide holding pattern where every so often they put out an album, and usually it's got some good songs, some bad songs. People tend to grab their favorites from it based on what Deicide includes from each album in their live sets. Like a lot of people dig the really percussive type stuff that was happening on Scars of the Crucifix. People also tend to really like the more consonant melodic parts on albums like Stench of Redemption. And yeah, I can see why they bust out songs like this live pretty often, because there's good songs on those. But generally, people seem to think that Deicide's classic era consists solely of those first four albums. And I was of that mind until maybe a couple years ago, when somebody opened my eyes to something that's going to make for another bit of a controversial take on my Deicide retrospective here. The album Incinerate Him from 2000, widely considered to be perhaps the worst Deicide album.
Well, it stinks.
I always thought that was the case and kind of took it for granted myself, till somebody actually made me listen to it, and turns out this album is actually really interesting, and I'm okay with lumping it in with the other classic Deicide albums. I mean, it's got the same thing that a lot of the later Deicide albums have going on, where they took like one song from it and still incorporate it into their live set, that being Bible Basher, mostly because it's got that intro riff goes like... and that sick fucking chorus part goes like... But honestly, the farther you go into this album, at least for me, the more I start noticing these songs are actually really good, and this is a pretty interesting development from Serpents of the Light. Like, obviously right here, this is a classic fucking Deicide sort of groove riff. But then they change it up into much more of a groovy sort of groove riff. A lot of people like to consider this the Pantera-fication of Deicide. I don't really see that. It's a little too angry sounding for that. The lead guitar on this album leans even more into consonants than it did on Serpents of the Light, which is another interesting development. But then you get to these chuggy parts that don't so much bounce as they churn. They have a decidedly nihilistic cast to them, particularly in their usage of full stops and how they seem to gradually slow down from their point of introduction. I would say this is less of a case of them slowing down to sell out and more of a case of Deicide attempting to pull it south of heaven, where they intentionally recorded a slower, more groove-oriented album in order to make their live set more of a dynamic roller coaster. That's just a theory, though. I need to listen to this album more, but honestly, upon reappraisal, I think it's a pretty good one. I just don't have it memorized the same way I do with the first 4 Deicide albums, which are all stone cold classics, and you should own all of them if you're into death metal. Otherwise, you're a
Flat out fucking poser!
Hey, even if you aren't into Deicide, I don't know what's wrong with you, but thanks for listening or watching, whatever you did, and have a Merry Kwanzmas.
Fuck's all that? Fiber optic cable, high-speed internet access. A lot of money in this shit.
Oh, yeah?